Let's talk about balance. Obviously, balance is extremely important when it comes to your animations. It's one of the biggest things that can make a pose feel off. For example, shifting your weight over one leg, your body shifts over that supporting leg as it takes the weight. Or kneeling down to pick something up, your hips have to shift backward to counter your upper body. If they didn't, you would tip over. These are some basic things that we do in everyday life to ensure we stay balanced as we're moving. But it can be easy to focus on balance only in the context of a single pose and not of the animation as a whole. There are so many moments through life when we are actually out of balance, and it's those tiny nuanced corrections we make in our body in order to maintain our balance that often can go overlooked in animation. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the importance of ensuring you are thinking about balance in the context of the entire animation and not just a single pose. So this first example we're going to take a look at is of a skateboarder, and I love skateboarding. I've been doing it for the majority of my life, so I actually have a couple skateboarding examples in here that we can take a look at. But skateboarding is actually a really great way to visualize and clearly see those tiny little nuanced adjustments that we do with our body in order to stay balanced. Obviously, when you're skateboarding, you're trying to stay on your skateboard, so your body is constantly doing these small little shifts in your balance so that you don't fall over. So let's go ahead and play this clip here. And it's of a skateboarder jumping down these large set of stairs. Obviously, their body is taking a lot of impact here, but if we go ahead and pause it right on the impact, you'll notice that when they land, they're actually pretty off balance here. Their hips are shifted pretty far over toward the right, and they're not really directly above their feet. You can see their center of balance is pretty far off. So if you're just to look at this in the context of this single pose, you would think he's pretty off balance. And if you were animating this, your first instinct would probably be to shift those hips more over his feet so that he feels more in balance. But if you look at this in the context of the entire movement, it actually makes sense, because once he lands, he quickly shifts his hips straight up so that he's able to bring his upper body more over his feet and then become more in balance. And you can see right when he lands, he has that quick little moment where he's out of balance, but it's that tiny nuanced adjustment that his body does, just that he's learned through the years of skateboarding, in order to make sure that he maintains his balance and is able to ride away. So if you were to animate something like this, again, your first instinct might be to go in here and really just think about this on a basic pose to pose level, and you would look at this and want to kind of shift these poses around, and that's fine. You could animate it that way and have it to where as soon as he lands, his body is always in balance, but you're kind of missing those tiny little nuanced adjustments that we do in real life in your animation. So you want to find these ways to pick out those moments that you can use in your animations to really bring out the believability, because it does also add a lot of interest to your animation. Those tiny little moments where your character might be out of balance and their body does a small little adjustment is really great to adding just a little bit more believability and interest in your animations. And we're just going to take another really quick look at this other example here. And this is a really sort of exaggerated example, because the way he's grinding this rail, he's having to make sure that his hips are really far back. And you can see just how far away his hips are from his feet. So again, looking at this in the context of a single pose, this pose feels really weird, but obviously with the trick he's doing, grinding around this circular rail, he's having to make sure he's really far backwards so that he doesn't fall forward over the rail. And then you can see as he straightens up here, his hips start to go a little bit more above his feet as he begins to jump off the end of the rail. So again, in your animations, it might not be this exaggerated where your character has to be sort of this far off balance in order to actually maintain their balance. And here we have another really great example of those moments when we are slightly out of balance, and it's those adjustments that we do to maintain our balance. So if we go ahead and just frame by frame this moment where basically he's just trying to stay balanced on the nose of his board without actually touching the front of his nose to the ground. But you'll notice as soon as he lands here, his hips are pretty far forward, and at this moment he's slightly off balance to where he's starting to actually tip forward, and then his nose is getting really close to the ground here. So what he does is basically shifts his chest forward, which then shifts his hips backward, which brings him more in balance. And you can see immediately when he does that, the board straightens out and he's back in balance. So there's a lot of those really small moments in this very short clip as he's trying to stay balanced here. You can see that this counter adjustment that he does with his chest to bring it forward in order to bring his hips backwards is then requiring him to try to straighten out just a little bit more because he kind of overcompensated for that adjustment. Now he's bringing his chest back up to bring his hips more in line with his feet. So again, you can see that if you were to focus and think about this only in the context of a single pose, your animations might miss out on these really awesome, tiny, little nuanced adjustments that our bodies do. And again, if you were to animate something like this, you could make sure that each pose is perfectly in balance. But again, it loses some of that interest that you find in real life. So in this other example, this is a more beginner skateboarder, and you can see clearly the difference between how this person is skating versus someone who is really experienced. You can see even just looking at something like their nose, you can see how much they sort of like shift back and forth to constantly try to make sure they're maintaining their balance on the skateboard, because for them, it's a lot more difficult to actually just stand on a skateboard. You can see as they try to do an ollie here, there's a really great moment where clearly once they land, they're really off balance here. Their weight is really shifted over their left leg. And just looking at this in the context of this single pose, you would know that he's probably going to start falling over. And that's exactly what he does here. You can see he starts to step off his board, and even through here, this entire moment, he's really off balance as his leg comes down to catch his fall, and he's still continuing to sort of stumble backwards before finally his left leg plants there to bring him back in balance. And actually this walk he does is a really great character moment. Just looking at the way he's walking, you really get the sense that he's tired and he's disappointed. And you may have heard before that if you look at just like a walk in real life, it's almost basically a controlled fall. We are bringing our hips forward, and if our legs didn't come out to plant, we would fall over. And you can actually see a really great example of that in this really sort of exaggerated walk he does with his hips coming forward. And through here, he's really bringing his hips forward first before that foot plants and brings him back in balance. And even here, when he's stepping forward, he's barely even lifting his foot up. His foot is just dragging on the ground. And then through here, you can see again, his hips are really leading that action. And all through here, if that foot did not come out and plant, obviously he would fall over. So I think this really helps to show that a lot of the movements that we do in real life, our bodies are actually out of balance a lot of the time. We're constantly shifting our hips around and our chest around to counter that motion so that we can actually maintain our balance. And it's really something you can only see in the context of the entire movement and not just focusing on the balance as it is in an individual pose. Because obviously if you look at everything in an individual pose, you're gonna wanna make sure that you're getting all of your poses perfectly in balance, even though it might not be that way in real life. So in this last skateboarding example we have here, I felt like it was a really great way to even showcase sort of a person's different skill level based on how they're actually able to keep their balance when they're on their skateboard. Obviously, the person we saw last was really new to skateboarding, and they're even just tracking something like their nose. You can see how much they're constantly trying to shift their body around to make sure they maintain their balance. But here, obviously, this person has been doing it quite a while, and even doing such a complex trick as this, if you just look at his nose, he's basically maintaining his balance almost perfectly through this entire trick. Just looking at his nose, you can see it just goes straight up. Even grinding down the rail, his nose is staying perfectly level all the way through to this land. And just looking at something like this person's balance, you can already see how comfortable they are on a skateboard by how they're maintaining their balance throughout the movement. So these last two examples we're going to take a look at is from the YouTube channel Motion Actor. If you're not subscribed to that channel, I highly recommend it. If you're doing any type of animation with any sort of body mechanics in it, they are constantly uploading these really awesome examples you can use as reference for your own animations. So we'll play this example here, and there's a really brief moment in here where the person is slightly off balance, but obviously with what their body is doing, it makes sense. So if we pause it here as he's stepping forward, obviously he's pushing his body forward and going to swing this leg out in a kick. But looking at this in this very brief moment, he is pretty off balance. But in the context of a movement, it doesn't really matter because he's bringing his full momentum forward and bringing that foot out into a kick. Even though he's off balance in this moment, he's quickly going to fix that once his leg swings out in that kick, pushes his body forward, and then immediately he's back in balance. But again, if you were thinking about this only in the context of a single pose, you might miss out on that very small little adjustment that he does in the motion if you were just thinking about this in that brief moment in this single pose where you might try to shift his hips forward just a little bit so that he's more directly over that supporting foot. So this last example here is really awesome in showing just how important it is to think about balance in the context of the actual movement. Because if we pause it at any moment here when he's doing these quick slashes, obviously just looking at this as a single pose, it feels like he would actually be almost jumping forward. This pose feels like he's pushing forward and is actually jumping. But if we play this, he's actually staying completely stationary and he's just bringing that foot up. But he's doing it so quickly that even though he's bringing it up and he's starting to fall forward, he brings it down to quickly catch himself. And again, looking at this in the context of the entire motion, it really makes sense. If you were to think about this only in the poses themselves, then it would seem really weird. But obviously with the motion that he's doing and how his body's moving, it makes sense. So hopefully this video was helpful in thinking about balance in the context of the entire movement and not just the poses themselves.